Hello and good afternoon. My name is Wendy Cho and I'm the Communications and Outreach Manager at Acterra. And I'd love to welcome you today to our lecture, Preparing Nature for a Changing Climate with Caitrin Chappelle of the Nature Conservancy. This is an event that we're hosting in collaboration with the forum. First, to get things started, I'd love to just introduce Jim Liskovac, who is a representative of the forum at Rancho San Antonio, who has made this event possible today. Jim is a seasoned amateur photographer. He's an avid birder. He's a traveler with his partner, Sue, an environmentalist, and above all, he is a citizen who is deeply concerned about climate change and willing to get the word out about it. So without further ado, here's Jim to explain a little bit about the forum.
Thanks, Wendy. Those of you watching over Zoom for the first time, a little bit about the forum. As Wendy said, Sue and I live at the forum at Rancho San Antonio in Cupertino, California. This is a retirement community, continuing care retirement community located on 54 acres in Cupertino, California. The forum is a life plan community, and we're adjacent to a 4,000 acre open space preserve. There are over, let me get this off. There are over 500 members of the forum, majority in independent living. The rest are in assisted living, skilled nursing, or memory care. The forum is owned by the residents, and it's operated by a management company under the direction of a board of resident directors. The open space preserve affords many opportunities for activities such as hiking and birding and photography. Sue and I are members of a small group here at the forum that focuses on making the forum a more sustainable place to live. The group addresses issues such as water, food, and energy. And so for forum members here, Wendy can give you a better picture of what Acterra is. So Wendy.
Thanks, Jim. So for anyone who's new to Acterra, let me explain a little bit about our organization. It's a 501c3 environmental nonprofit based in the Bay Area. And our pillars are beneficial electrification, healthy plate, healthy planet, which is about sustainable food. We have a pillar about youth advocacy and education, something that is very important for encouraging our future climate solutions. And we have a fourth pillar on workplace sustainability, making green teams have better resources and also giving awards to sustainable businesses for their leadership. And so at Acterra, one of our major strategies is encouraging individual behavior change to have a healthier planet. And we also do policy advocacy at the state and local level to encourage smart, climate-friendly policies. So that's a little bit about Acterra. We've been around for over 50 years. So a little bit more about the lecture series. It's part of the education pillar, which includes our public lecture series, as well as two other programs. Youth Be the Change is an exciting program that we just launched recently for middle schoolers to learn more about climate change science and solutions, and to become more involved in their community and how to create local solutions. And we also have the Acterra Student Ambassadors Program, which is a new program for high school students and also community college students. We get them involved in attending city council meetings, writing to their legislators, and making their voices heard to all their electeds, which is really fantastic. And then a really quick note about some of our upcoming events. We have coming up on Friday, Building Community for Electrification, which is a follow-up to our Code Red event, if you guys saw that in January. We have our big fundraiser and climate action benefit called Promise to Our Planet on March 25th. That's a virtual event, and it's taking place, 5 o'clock on Friday, March 25th. We have a lot of exciting guest speakers. We have a fund to future, and we have some breakout sessions as well. And then finally, we have, in the month of March, we have a zero waste cooking event on March 30th. I'm sorry, I think it's March 31st, sorry for that, with the Zero Waste Chef, who is a really well-known blogger who is called Anne-Marie Bonneau, and her nickname is Zero Waste Chef. That will be a great workshop. You can bring your own vegetables to this virtual event and make a delicious soup featuring low waste cooking. And then we have some exciting events coming up in April. We have an electric vehicle workshop in Palo Alto that's in person on April 10th. We have a heat pump water heaters workshop, so you can learn all about the benefits of having an electric heat pump water heater instead of gas on April 13th. And we have our Green Team Network Spring Forum on April 14th. It's called Wellness in the Workplace. And don't forget that we have another lecture in this series, another Nature Conservancy scientist and ecologist, Kristen Scheib, will be speaking about fire and climate change on April 27th. Quick thank you to our series underwriters, without whom this programming would not be possible. Thank you to Marion Clinton Gilliland and Armand and Elion Nickermans. And thank you so much to our series sponsors, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and the Foster, located in Palo Alto. To keep our events free, we encourage everyone who is able to contribute and do a little donation so that our programming can continue into the future. You can go to acterra.org/donate now. Now on to tonight's program. We're so fortunate to have Caitrin Chappelle. She's the Associate Director of the Nature Conservancy's California Water Program, leading the Healthy Rivers and Springs strategy. In a prior role, she managed research and operations at the Public Policy Institute Water Policy Center. And her areas of expertise are quite broad. They include the California drought, actually the Western drought, funding gaps in water management, and ecosystem stressors and natural resource management in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. And she also has a bachelor's from Cal Poly and a master's from UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. So without further ado, oh, and I'd like to just mention that after her presentation, we will have time for questions. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Caitrin.
Hi, everybody. Oh, that's on. Okay, so I want to give a couple, preambles to my talk. The first is, very excited to be here. You are my first group of warm bodies in person for a presentation in about 2 years, exactly 2 years, I think, this week. So I've been doing talks like this. Public speaking is a big part of my job and what I do, but it's all been on Zoom. So please be nice to me as my first wade back into real people. And also not being, protected by a computer screen and my notes right in front of me. So I'm going to do my best without it, but I think you guys seem nice, so we'll make our way through. The second thing I wanted to just mention quickly before I get started is I'm going to talk to you very specifically about one piece of the way that our climate is impacting nature, and that's the way it's impacting especially our freshwater biodiversity, our rivers, our streams, and all of the animals that rely on them. But as Wendy mentioned, I have a long history of working in California water. For the last 12 years, I've been working closely on policy issues, funding issues, and other things related to California water. And I know we are in a moment right now where there's a lot of questions around drought and water scarcity. So I welcome questions that are broader than what I talk about today. And if I can't answer them, then I probably can help you find an answer to them. So I just wanted to mention that up front. So my plan is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do and the Nature Conservancy. And then I'm going to give an overview of the way that climate change is impacting nature in California, specifically, like I said, the way it's impacting our rivers and our streams. And I'm going to make a case for why water management is the way that climate is most impacting our state right now. And then I'm going to talk to you about the problems facing our freshwater biodiversity and the species that are being hit the hardest. And then I'm going to talk to you about ways that we can build resilience in those systems, that they can be more adaptable to a changing climate over time. And my hope is you come away from this thinking about two things. One, that we've got a big problem ahead of us, but two, that there's some really smart people out there trying to do some cool things to find some solutions. So that's my hope for our time together. Okay, so first and foremost, if you are not aware of the Nature Conservancy, let me just take a moment to tell you who they are. The Nature Conservancy is a global environmental NGO. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. Full disclosure, I joined the Nature Conservancy less than a year ago, but I've been working closely with this organization for years, so it was really exciting for me to officially come on board. TNC works globally, like I mentioned. It started as a classic land trust organization, which meant that it went out and it purchased land that they thought needed to be protected and conserved. And it's grown out of that mission to protect over 125 million acres of land globally in 79 countries. And we in the US have a Nature Conservancy chapter in all 50 states. I want to mention that while it started as this land use land trust organization, it's broadened a lot beyond that. So the work that I do has a component of that. We have properties that we manage. We're out there, if things are for sale, thinking about should they be bought and conserved. But the work that we do also includes developing the science and the policy needed to tackle some of our biggest environmental issues. At the Nature Conservancy globally, we're focusing on 4 key areas. The first is to tackle climate change. This is mainly around changing our energy use and the way that we are emitting greenhouse gases. The second is to protect land and water. Third, provide food and water sustainability. And fourth, to build healthy cities. And so here in California, the way that we are narrowing that to our work and our work within the water program is we have 3 main pillars of work within my team. The first is on thriving birds and wetlands. So this is about protecting the wetlands up and down the state of California that are relied on for both birds that are always in California and the birds that are passing through, migratory birds. The second is on sustainable water supplies. And this is about balancing human use and what is needed to protect and conserve our ecosystems. And the third is healthy rivers. And that's about keeping water in our rivers and streams when and where nature needs it. So this is my job. No big deal, right? There's it's a lot to do, but gratefully I have a really fantastic team, and the Nature Conservancy has been working on these issues for a long time. So I'm excited to talk to you about some of the things that we do to try to tackle some of these issues. So before I dive in a little bit more, I want to put some framing on why I think talking about water and climate change together is so important, and why talking about ecosystem conservation and protection and water conservation and protection is so crucial for us as humans. I think this statement probably feels obvious to everyone, but I'd just like to remind that water is life, and the thing that separates us from everywhere else in the universe that we know of so far is our water here on Earth. And so when I'm going to talk over the next 20 minutes or so about the importance of protecting fresh water and protecting water in our rivers and streams, I'm going to do it through a lens of why that's important for the fish and for the birds and for the wetlands. But really, why it's important is because having those ecosystems healthy means that we can continue to rely on them for our own lives. If our rivers dry up, then our lives dry up. If our wetlands dry up, our lives dry up. So we're so connected through water that I like to start that, because I'm going to go into the weeds about animals and species, and I just like to start to remind that this is why it's important. There's plenty of reasons to care about individual species in and of themselves and why they're important, and values around protecting endangered species. But for me, what really drives I think that by protecting these ecosystems, I'm protecting my life, my family's life, my the future generation's life here in California. Okay, so now to the problem. So at a global scale, we're facing two big problems simultaneously. The first is that 40% of the world's people are affected by water scarcity, which means that there are people around the globe who don't have access to either safe or affordable water to live, to drink. While at the same time, a third of our freshwater species are facing extinction. And just to put it into some context, over the last 30 to 50 years ago or so, freshwater species have started to decline and go extinct at twice the rate of our ocean species and our terrestrial species. So these freshwater species are really vulnerable globally. And here's a pretty picture for you of some of the freshwater species here in California. California's freshwater biodiversity is amazing. We have more endemic, which means only found here in California, freshwater species than any other place in the country. And they range from birds, migratory birds that will rely on freshwater habitat for just a part of their life cycle, to, of course, things like fish, which rely on a river for their entire life cycle. Some of them are fully freshwater species, and some of them, like salmon, come in and out of our rivers and streams and out into the Pacific Ocean. So they're not only taking advantage of our rivers and our streams, but they go out into the great wide ocean and then they come back. So one of the reasons I like to show this slide is I like people to get a visual picture of what we're talking about here in the range of habitats and species that we're talking about when we talk about freshwater biodiversity. Okay, so since the state was founded, and over, what is it now, 150 years ago? I can't do the math quickly. But it was since the state was founded, and even with the passage of environmental protection laws in the last 30 or 40 years, we have seen a steady decline in the health of our freshwater species. Now I'll talk about two specific ones, what we would call some of the most iconic, and that is salmon and then some of our migratory birds. So salmon, the maps on your left are the 4 habitat ranges for 4 of our salmon species in California. These are all unique and endemic to California, which means they're uniquely a part of our system here. And the dark red is where they currently are found. And then the light orange is where you could see they used to be. Over 1,500 dams across the state of California have blocked passage for salmon migration over the last 30 or 40 years. And then the way that we use water by taking it out of the system or putting, like I said, dams on rivers and streams has changed the amount of water and the timing of water in these rivers and streams, leading to a fundamental decline in the health of salmon and populations reducing significantly. And 3 or 4 of our salmon populations are considered federally, are listed as endangered species. And so this problem, what it sets up for us here, before we even start talking about climate change, is that the system that we've already built has put these species in a precarious situation. The reason I like to talk about salmon, back to my water is life slide and why you should care about this, is, you know, we all kind of sometimes can think about salmon, or I sometimes know that we can think about salmon very specifically, which is it's a pink fish that we like to eat. Some people who have spent a lot of time fly fishing or up in some of these watersheds have seen, have seen the way that these fish move throughout our watersheds. They're a really incredible species. One of the things that I like to point out about why they're important and why they deserve protection, both now and in a changing climate, is because they're fundamental to the health of our watersheds. And like I said, they travel up and down our rivers and our streams and out into the ocean. So they're a bit of they're a species that can give us an indication of how well an ecosystem is doing generally. And if the salmon can't survive there, it's just not a good sign for the rest of the ecosystem. Plus, they're really important cultural species for our native indigenous people here in California. And they're a really important part of our economy as well. There's fishing towns and a fishing community that is built around maintaining the health of this species over time. The other one I wanted to talk about before I get into what's happening with our climate is the Pacific Flyway. And so this is a really important habitat, which is a part of, it goes up and down the western coast. And California is a really big part of it. And water birds that travel along the Pacific Flyway as part of their migratory pattern rely on California wetlands to stop on the way while they're migrating. And so what you're looking at a picture of here is California's Central Valley. You can see San Francisco, I think you could probably see a little bit right there. So this is all inland. And what was in the past historical was there was just a wide, very long historical habitat of wetlands up and down the state that these birds could rely on. And so in the last 100 years or so, mainly because of the way we've changed the land use there with agricultural practices, our wetlands and water bodies have shrunk from about 3 million acres to less than 500,000 acres. So the amount of habitat that these migratory birds relied on significantly decreased. And therefore the amount of birds that we see coming through California continues to decrease as well, from tens of millions down to less than 7 million birds annually. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still quite a feat, these 7 million birds that come through our state, and we get to see some pretty amazing migratory patterns here. But in times of drought, like we're experiencing right now, these habitats get even smaller. And what happens when there's not enough habitat and that the species are used to is they can suffer from really major issues with not getting the right amount of food, illness. When there's too many of these birds all crammed into one tiny little wetland, they can get ill. And then also just long-term declines in population as there's less habitat for them over time. Okay, so all of that is the bummer, which is we're already in a freshwater biodiversity crisis. And we were already in one before our climate started changing and before we started to see the impacts of climate change. So we created this system that took a lot from nature and it took a lot from our ecosystems. And we built something pretty amazing out of it. I mean, the state of California is a wonder. It holds over 40 million people. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. It's the largest ag economy in the world, but there have been consequences. And nature has felt the largest hit and burden of that over time. So what I like to think is that while climate change is daunting, it actually provides a critical window of adaptation for us to think about how we could protect our wildlife and our communities moving forward. Okay, I'm gonna open my water. Speaking of water. So I'm sure many of you in this room know, because of your time here in California or just being here on Earth, know that droughts are a normal part of California. They're a recurring feature. They always have been. California has the most variable climate of any state in the nation, which means we get the most swings from wet to dry on a year-to-year basis than anywhere else. And our system was built on this variability. We knew that. That's why we built big dams to capture the water when it was wet. And that's why we, over the last, especially 30, 40 years, I guess now when you do the math, it's almost 50, since the big 76, 77 drought, there's been incredible investments in water efficiency. It's why we've like I said, been able to have more people in California, yet water use in cities and suburbs especially has stayed about the same. So we've known that droughts are a recurring part of our climate. But what's happening is that warming is making them worse. So at the top, on the top panel, you'll see blue is wet years. These are above average precipitation years, and orange is below average precipitation years. So you'll see that kind of the variance has been about the same, but what's been really changing has been temperature. So we're in a warming period. So the bottom graphic here is showing you the red above average temperature years, blue below. And we've just been seeing this warming trend over time. And so for that reason, managing water is at the forefront of climate change adaptation, and for a few reasons. The first is, like I said, that rising temperatures. This figure right here is showing you how by mid-century, we'll be about 2 to 4 degrees warmer across the state on average. Those rising temperatures are having some severe impacts on our water system in 3 ways. The first is a shrinking snowpack. Because it's warmer, less of our rain is falling as snow and less is staying as snow. It gets warmer faster up in the Sierras, so it's melting faster. Why this matters is, like I said, we built an entire system on a different climate. And so we built our dams and our infrastructure to think about our snowpack slowly releasing water over the spring and us being able to capture it and use it. And what we've seen in the last drought from 2012 to 16, and then what we're seeing right now, literally right now happening, is that it's so much warmer in the Sierras that that water is either melting faster, it's not maintaining its snowpack, so it's coming down quicker, or it's just sinking into the ground. It's not kind of creating the slow release that we're used to and our system was built on. So that's one issue. The next is that we're seeing shorter, more intense wet seasons. So climate models are showing that we might on average get the same amount of rain over a long period of time, but they're gonna come in these very short, intense times. And then the last is that we're having more volatile precipitation. There'll be more dry years and more wet years. And I think we all can remember, let's all go back to last summer, drought, right? Drought, it's just so dry. It's the driest it's ever been. It's the warmest and it's the driest across the West. And it was the 3rd driest water year we'd ever seen on record, along with the warmest. And those things combined made it a really exceptional year for drought. And then in October, we saw the most intense atmospheric river we'd ever seen in Northern California. More rain fell in a single day in San Francisco than had ever been recorded, and even more so farther north in the state. So in a matter of days, the governor made a statewide drought declaration, like we're all in a drought, and days later, we broke all of our rain records. So it's amazing to me when I started in this line of work, I actually started working for someone who did climate modeling. And this was about 15 years ago. And it's amazing to me to be living through the exact things he described when he talked about the way climate was going to impact water. Like, exactly. He said there will be these big storm events and then it'll be dry the rest of the year. And so it's happening. And my takeaway here is that while we spent a lot of time talking about a changing climate, I think what we need to be pivoting to is the concept of a changed climate. It's changed, and now we need to start adapting for both of ourselves and for nature. Oh, and that's what I just said. California is already experiencing a changed climate. So the 2 biggest ways that this changed climate is impacting us is through these more severe droughts, which I'm going to talk about, and wildfires. And I'm going to pin on the wildfires because my colleague, Kristen, is going to come talk to you all about that in about a month. But if there's questions about that, I can try and answer them. But essentially, these same things, less snow, a longer dry period, warmer temperatures, are also not only leading to these severe droughts, but these also very severe fire seasons. So these are the 2 ways that, in my opinion, climate change is really impacting California right now. And the way that it's impacting nature is that big problem I set out for you at the beginning, where our species, we are seeing these declines, where the health of our rivers and the health of our streams and the health of our wetlands were already not doing great. We have now turned the volume up on those ecosystems, turn the volume up on the challenges and pressures that they're experiencing through these very severe dry periods. And the way that that is the most prominent for the people who pay very close attention, like me, is in the way it's impacting our salmon populations. So our wild Chinook salmon population, which relies on the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River, is on the brink of extinction. I mean, there's no other way to talk about it. And every time we have one of these very dry years, we just push them a little bit closer. And the thing is, these are amazing animals. And like I said, droughts have always been a part of California. Droughts have always been a part of our climate. And truthfully, salmon adapted to droughts. They're amazingly adaptable species, and they adapted to droughts. Now, one of the ways that they do that is they have these 3-year life cycles. They come up into the rivers and streams. They go out into the ocean. So over 3 years, they're able to build up their population. When it's a really wet year, then booms, and when it's a dry year, but they adapted to droughts. But what we've done is we have constrained and tightened this system so much around them that even their ability to adapt is starting to fail. And here's why. Are you guys really bummed out yet? Okay, so here's why. First and foremost, water in California is over allocated. We are using too much water to be humans here, both in our cities and in our suburbs, but even more so to sustain the agricultural footprint that we have. Water in California is allocated about 5 times the rate that is naturally produced every year through the water cycle. So we are just, between how much water we take from the rivers and streams and how much we're pumping out of the ground, we're just like overdrafting our bank account on a yearly basis. We're just bad water budgeters. The second reason that nature gets so impacted is that water for nature is not assured. And what I mean by that is when we came to California, I'm using the royal we, when the settlers came, the indigenous people who are already here, but when the settlers came, they took a little piece of paper and they put it on a tree and said, this is my plot of land. They also got the water that went with it. And nobody ever put a little piece of paper on a plot of tree, nailed it in and said, you got to keep 30% of this in the river for fish. So there's just no right to water for the environment in California. It's not built into our system. So the only way that someone like me or my organization or environmental advocates can protect water for nature is through regulation. Big government coming in and taking water away from people. So what that does is it sets up this zero-sum dynamic that by protecting nature, protecting these ecosystems, we're taking water away from humans. And that's just a bummer. It's conflict-ridden. People talk about the California water wars. They talk about fish versus farms. And the reason why that exists is because we set up the system to exist that way. That's how we created this system. And that's why nature keeps losing, because we keep on protecting ourselves and not it. And we haven't recognized that by protecting nature, we are protecting ourselves. So I think I've said all this. Hold on. Okay, so why is nature hit so hard? This is kind of what I'm already saying. So the first is that there's very little buffer for nature. So when a drought hits, when a year like the one we're in right now and the past year hit, they've already been operating at a diminished capacity. So it's like somebody who's like already sick, getting sicker. So there's very little buffer for them. Bringing it back to salmon, like I said, they have these 3-year life cycles. And so when we have a multi-year drought and year after year, we use so much water that there's temperature issues and there's thousands of fish that die in the river. And we do that 3 years in a row, and it's already an endangered species. We are just pushing this fella we're taking them to the edge, and they're barely holding on. The other reason is because we have optimized the way we use water in California in a way that just doesn't allow any flexibility. So back to the way water rights work is that we have set up the expectation that everyone should always get their water, and that when there's a dry year, there's a fight about what should happen, instead of setting up a system where maybe we just assume everybody gets 75%. And then if it's a wet year, you get a little more. But instead, we've set ourselves up with this system that we're always just fingers crossed that more rain will come, instead of planning for a year where there won't be any rain. I'll give you an example. What is it? March 16th? Yeah, March 16th. we are just now, as a state, really digging in to what we're going to do this year to manage our water because it's so dry. We knew last year that we were in trouble, but we've spent the last 6 months, maybe since that beautiful rainstorm in October, going, well, maybe it'll be a wet year, so we'll be fine. And we've not done any advanced planning. And advanced planning for nature especially is very rare. All of the water agencies that make sure that we have water to drink and to wash our clothes, they have to plan for droughts. If you guys didn't turn on your tap and water wasn't there, what would happen? Major problem, right? But advanced planning for nature and advanced planning for agriculture is rare. And so that's one reason why when it happens, when a drought happens, nature is hit so hard. So what I want to talk about now is climate resilience. So how can we take this system that has been managed to the brink, that set us up for conflict, that's making it so some of our most archaic species aren't able to survive, and how can we make it more resilient? And when I think about climate resilience, I think about two things. First, that our ecosystems and our communities are healthy enough to weather extreme years, so that we are able to be, when a drought comes, we aren't thinking, especially like in a year we're about to have, this is the worst case scenario. We're thinking, okay, plan for this, or we set aside water for this, or we made investments over the last 3 or 4 years in nature, in our communities, whatever, so that we were more prepared. That's what climate resilience means to me. It doesn't mean that during dry years, we won't have to cut our water use. It doesn't mean that in dry years that there won't be impacts to nature. It just means that in those years, it doesn't mean game over for anybody. It means we can weather that. The second thing that I think climate resilience means is to stop pretending that there is a normal climate and to start adapting our system to just be flexible for whatever kind of year we might have. And the best way to do that is to build buffers into our system. So I'm going to talk about how that can be done. I'm going to first take some water. Okay. So the first way we can think about building buffers into our system and building climate resilience is to make significantly more investments in nature itself. We, as a state and as a society, we really can get our arms around a crisis. Like, there will be a lot of money going towards endangered species, especially over the next few years, to try and pull back some of the damage that's been done, for example, to salmon. What we're not good at doing is pre-thinking what investments might be needed over time to avoid that happening. So the way that we have thought about environmental management is that when there's a crisis, we'll swoop in, instead of protecting and investing in the ecosystems and species that are doing fine right now. Now, this can mean a few things. This can show up in the way that we do our land use planning when we talk about how we are going to grow as a state. This can be about how we think about things that are sometimes, if done in collaboration with nature, are more effective. So things like flood protection. We used to put up big levees up and down rivers to just stop rivers from going anywhere. And then we build towns around it. And now there's a shift to thinking about, well, what if we did two things at once? What if we protected nature, but we also built more wetlands, more floodplains, more flood protection that was more natural? So when I say invest in nature, what I'm thinking is invest in things, nature-based solutions that over time will build this resiliency into our system that we need. The second thing is we need to give the environmental water right. How this will be done is very hard, and I can answer some questions about this, but essentially what it would require is just blowing up the entire water rights system that already exists. This is the political problem. The first one's the investment problem. How do we get cities, private companies to invest in nature-based solutions, to invest in things that incorporate climate resilience, incorporate ecosystems into the way we build our cities and our businesses? The second one is the political problem. How do we change the system the way it currently exists to no longer be so about how much can we take and more about what does the system need and then what can we use above that. The third is to restore ecosystem function. What I mean by that is a lot of the ways that we have as humans built our lives here on planet Earth is we've tamed nature. We've said, that was too wild for me. I'm going to make this place not as wild. I'm going to pave it, or I'm going to channelize this river, or I'm going to build a dam and I'm going to let the same amount of water out all year long. Most of these species, like I said, did not adapt to that. They did not adapt to a human world. But we have the tools and the information to, in a lot of places, restore ecosystem function. And this doesn't even require more water. What it just means is more water when the fish need it. So instead of out of a dam, just releasing water all year long, instead release it a big pulse in the spring, right when the salmon are coming up, and then another one in the fall, right when the spawners are going out. It seems like common sense, especially after, but it's not done commonly. And what we've done instead is just to really, like I said, manage the system as if nature did not evolve to be a part of it. So there's some places around the state where it's actually not about less water. We're not worried about more water in the rivers and streams. We're worried about when the water is there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then lastly, the third thing or fourth thing we can do is we can plan for the years that we know are coming. So this goes back to the idea that we're, at the last minute scrambling that it's a drought again. And people that, this is their job to plan for water management, sit around hoping for a March miracle instead of being proactive. And I don't blame them. This is the system we've had forever and ever, but we just need to switch it. We need to invest in planning. And these things would be relevant not just for freshwater biodiversity and salmon and wetlands like I've been talking about. This is really important for other types of nature too. And I'm sure Kristen will talk about how this relates to the forest as well. Okay, so I want to leave you with some hope, okay? So this is the northernmost coastal part of our state. The picture that I'm showing you here is the colors represent the importance for salmon restoration. So the dark blue are just very important watersheds, but essentially this picture is showing you a range of watersheds up and down the coast that are really important for especially coho salmon. If you took this map and overlaid it to that one that I showed you earlier that had their ranges, this would overlap really closely with the coho salmon. So this is where we're doing a lot of our work. This is a priority region for us. The nice thing about this northern part of the state is there's lots of water up there, actually. It's a very wet area. Even in dry years, it gets more water than other parts of the state. Now, this is different than like our Central Valley, which there's big dams, there's a couple big rivers, and there's, the state operates dams on there and the federal government operates dams on there, and there's big players and it's very political. What's happening in the northern part of our state is there's a lot of small diverters. So there's hundreds, thousands of people who for their own house, for their own farm, for their own small town or city, have their own small, little siphons out of the river. And we've done our analysis on here. And for this part of the state, what it's really about is two things. One is when the water is being taken. So most of the time, for a lot of these diverters, they are taking water at exactly the same time that the water needs to be in there to maintain connectivity or flows in the river for the fish. But they're taking it because it's warm and it's summer and they need water too. So we're taking it at the same time the fish do. And we've done analysis that if we just took the water in early spring or late winter, like late fall, and avoided that summer season, and if we took our water out then the overall change to the agricultural footprint, to the people who live up there wouldn't be huge, but it would maintain enough ecosystem function and water in the river over time that the system, we would see recovery. So what this is about is going and making relationships with local communities, local RCDs, and essentially it's, for some places, it's as simple as like building a large storage tank on someone's small farm property. They take their water out in winter and they store it, then they use it in summer. And for that small stretch, it completely changed how the system was working. It made the water more reliable for the people because then they're not waiting for summer flows, which are less reliable in case it is a drought year. And it made it better for fish because the river never just stayed open and salmon could go where they needed to go. So this is what we're doing up and down the northern coast of California right now. The other thing that we're doing is, on top of changing that kind of timing of how we're taking water, is we're doing major investments in habitat restoration. And so I want to give one small example, which is this little river right here, of the 10 Mile. It's really important habitat for coho salmon. And over the last 20 years or so, we've done restoration projects up in the watershed where we've done forest management all the way down to where the mouth of the river reaches the sea. And we've restored the channel habitat, created more places for salmon to go, more floodplains, took out small little dams that were in their way that weren't doing anything for anybody anyways, and worked our way up the 10 Mile from the from the forest down to the mouth of the estuary. And this is the one river in California where over the last 10 years, we've seen salmon numbers increasing instead of decreasing. And so those two things, changing the timing of how water is being used and doing these long channel restoration projects, we're turning, what we like to say is we're turning the light on in that river for these species. And the point is, when we talk about preparing nature for changing climate, what we've done there is we've prepared that we've built, by having those numbers increase, we've built up the health of that ecosystem enough that a year like we're having right now won't be catastrophic. They can get through a few bad years and then come back when we get more rain. And we haven't had to fallow a bunch of land out there or take out a bunch of production of agriculture, or we've just had to create local partnerships. So I just want to leave with a little bit of hope on top of all of my doomsday, that solutions are out there, and the biggest ingredients are cooperation, flexibility, and frankly, investment and money. And this is not going to be a cheap thing to do, but I think it's going to be worth it. I think that's my last slide. All right, thank you.
You didn't say anything about how the ocean rise is going to affect California.
I didn't. Sea level rise will be pretty significant for California. The ways that it's going to impact us as humans is really within our infrastructure and with our where our cities are for those that are coastal. There are places where over time it may become impossible to live there without some major investments. When it comes to nature, one of the things that I find really helpful to think about is that most of these things most of the nature-based solutions I talked about that we could be investing in would help with things like sea level rise. So more wetlands, setting back roads and instead filling it in with dune lands, things like that. Nature is actually a really good buffer for sea level rise. If we could put more of nature between us and the ocean over the next 30 to 50 years, then our cities will be in better shape. But as far as like the impact to ecosystems, that's actually not something that I know that much about as far as sea level rise goes.
Just adding another question from the audience here. Someone would like to know if you could talk a little bit, Caitrin, about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and does this offer any hope?
Oh, I love a wonky question. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed in 2016, and it's the first time that groundwater, so the water that is in the ground underneath us and groundwater basins that we pump for our use, It's the first time that California is regulating the use of groundwater. So what it did was it made it so that local water agencies had to look at the way that they were using groundwater, and they had to talk about how it was going to be sustainable yield by 2040, which means that they were not going to take more out of the ground than could be naturally replenished. So the answer to the question of it could help is yes. It's really making local water agencies, especially agricultural regions, really take a hard look about that kind of over allocation of water that they've been doing, how they've been drawing on the bank account. One of the things that might be challenging about it is its time frame. It's a long regulatory planning process. By the time it gets really underway in the next 15 or so years, a lot of damage has already been done. But I'm personally hopeful that anything that's making people think about their overall water use will help with the challenges that I'm talking about here. One thing I did not mention explicitly is a lot of these rivers and streams that species rely on are what are called groundwater dependent. So they're actually getting their water, their springs that can actually come up from groundwater basins. So when you overpump the groundwater, it can suck water right out of rivers and springs. So more sustainably managing our groundwater basins is a big part of this. Yes.
Thank you. Another question is whether desalination is something that the Nature Conservancy is considering in terms of water management and water adaptation to drought.
Okay, great question. So desalination is a great tool in the toolbox. The biggest problem with desalination is its expense. It's really expensive water. Once you go through all the energy costs and building the infrastructure, it's very expensive. So there are desalination plants that are being built right now in California, up and down the coast for some coastal communities that are willing to pay more for water for it to be to use desalination. Where I don't see what I could see desalination doing is if more communities will invest in it and they're able to use less water from rivers and groundwater, then I could see it helping to take the pressure off of nature. If desalination is just used to have more water and they keep using the same amount from rivers and streams, then that doesn't solve this problem. The other thing is desalination is really tricky for farms because of the cost. So a lot of farms, because agriculture pays less for water than we do for the waters in our homes and businesses, the cost of desalination is pretty prohibitive to then make a profit on and using on a farm. So it's not as helpful for those two things, but if it is used to take the pressure off of our rivers and streams, then it could be helpful. It's not something that we at my team at the Nature Conservancy spends a lot of time on.
Thank you. We have a question here, which is a bit of going back to the sort of the bummer aesthetic. So we were talking about the sort of hopeful future for water management, where we can weather the catastrophic years by smarter management and more flexibility. But what about when we take ourselves several decades into the future and we don't see any curbing of these effects in the models, and the effects will just become more and more drastic? Do we reach a point where we just cannot adapt our way out of that problem, that crisis?
Oh boy, I don't know if I can answer that question. That reminds me of, I was with my son's class and they knew I had a degree in marine biology, and one of them asked me, where did the oceans come from? And I said, well, that's a big question for me. I would say that I think we can adapt to anything. I also would say that it will be at some expense. My hopeful view is that we can find a way to adapt that preserves the way of life we're used to in California. The other thing is that we also, I sometimes wonder if impacts to humans is what's really going to make us really shift our behavior. And that's to be seen. I think that a lot of us think about climate change in ways that are pretty existential still. I think the fires in California over the last few years and these droughts are really bringing it home for us. And I think that we're getting closer to a place where as individuals and as communities and as a state and as a country, we're taking it more seriously. So I'm hopeful, but I don't think I could do my job if I wasn't. So if the answer was no, then I'd just go do something else.
Yeah, it does seem to add on to what you were saying, that if we do manage to curb our greenhouse gases now, it will make your job easier down the line. You won't have to fight so hard.
I'm sure there'll be another problem, but yeah.
That's right. That's right. So a question that I had was, could you talk a little bit about whether you are engaging with indigenous communities when you do this research and planning?
Yeah. The answer is yes. Even more so recently. I think it's something that as an environmental community, we need to get better at over time. We're often talking about things and solution sets that they know intrinsically, and they look at us like, yeah, duh. I've been telling you this for centuries. And so, yes, especially in that Northern California region, where there are some local tribes up there where conservation objectives are really overlapping, and they're incredible partners. I think it's our job as an environmental organization to support them in their efforts to bring back some of their ways of management to the land. And so for me personally, I like to follow their lead. We have one project happening right now up in the Klamath Basin where they're incredible partners. They've got centuries old knowledge on how the river system has worked, and it's really important to rely on them and to lift them up and make sure that their scientists and their work is really featured. And we learn a lot from them, and they learn a lot from us.
That's great. So a quick question from the Zoom audience. It's a really powerful question. Why isn't the governor making this an emergency?
Not a betting woman, but if I was, on April 1st, he will be. On April 1st, it will be when they do the official snow survey and see how much snow is left up in the Sierras, and it will not be good. And there will likely be a drought emergency declaration. They're already doing voluntary drought kind of asks for people to start conserving water. There's rules right now. You can't wash your lawn or wash your car outside. You can't, there's rules. Whether or not this governor will do what Jerry Brown did and ask for 25% conservation across the state, I don't know. But what he is doing, or what his agencies are doing, is right now, and my critique of them is that it took until they had to wait too late in the water year to start planning, but they are starting to think about what this year is going to look like. The problem is usually by the time a drought is declared, it's too late. The water's gone. And so there's not a lot you can do besides us as individuals doing what we can. But as far as large scale changes to the system, usually what happens is for the water users who get their water from the state or federal projects, which are the two big water projects down the central part of the state, they get less of their water allocated to them. They're saying this year they think it's going to be between 10 and 15%. So farms will start thinking about fallowing some land, and then we'll be probably asked to conserve as well.
One last question here from the Zoom audience. It's a graduate student on the East Coast, and they're asking if you could do a little comparison with the conditions, I guess, for water rights are very different perhaps on the East Coast. And can you talk a little bit about what might be pros and cons of that? Or I don't know if that's outside your scope, but they're curious, are some of the problems, would those be addressed if we could conform more with some other forms of laws and present in other places? Exactly.
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference between us Western states and then those on the East Coast is we have this kind of what's called first in time, first in right water system, which was when I was joking about nailing a piece of paper to the tree and saying, this is my land and this is my water right. So there's a lot of senior political water rights here that I don't think exist back east, mainly because the way back east was developed was just very different. Also, there's just a lot more water and they just don't have the same scarcity issues. The place I like to look to for an example on how we might improve is Australia. And what they did during their millennium drought, which was now 20 years ago, which is crazy, is they did what I talked about, which is changing the way water rights are set up to include having a water right for nature. So they created what was called environmental base flows. And like, these are the flows that need to stay for the environment. And then we have to adapt on top of that. It was pretty politically challenging. It required billions of dollars because essentially they bought out a bunch of water users for their water rights. Was a major shift in land use changes. Some parts went great, some parts didn't, but we could learn. That's the place I like to look to for examples is Australia. Plus, we're a lot like Australia.
Fabulous. Well, let's give another round of applause for Caitrin for today. And thank you so much.